Good evening, everyone. For the last time I can say that officially for the year 2021, this is Rose City Politics. It is December 29th, and it's time for year in review. The best part of the end of the year is that we get to do our council report cards and we get to do our year in review, which is sort of, depending on how we want to come to the table, a great opportunity to raise up some positivity or tear down, mock, and chide our way through. This is going to be a fun show. I think it'll have a little bit of both. Our regular panel tonight includes myself, John Lidke. We have Doug Sartori coming from the camp out
in the blanket fort. It's the last week of December. I never work, and I always spend the week in my blanket fort. So I'm coming to you live from the pillow fort.
Looks like glamping to me.
Looks comfortable. We have Pat Papadayas. Pat, how are you doing?
I'm okay, a little bit under the weather, sort of symbolic of this year, I think. I don't know, just a little bit of, I've tested negative, so that's not it. But so it's something else. I think it's John's Cooties.
Could be, yeah, because I feel like crap too.
I had a little bit of a just feeling under the weather as well. And I thought it makes sense. We record together all the time, but no, we haven't done that in 2 full years. So it can't be that. Just feels like it sometime. With Don Merrifield, it feels like we're closer than we're not. Don, how you doing?
Well, as Pat said, I've tested positive for Cooties. So I'm a little under the weather too. So we'll try and get through this without coughing up a lung.
Do your best.
You've got some tea there to get you through it, as well as
some Gretzky whiskey with that too.
There's some tea and a nice chaser the way that you do it. We are glad to have you all here. If you've been with us this whole year and you haven't signed up at patreon.com/Rose City Politics, you have missed out, because we have actually put out one of our 2 to 3 that we usually do on a yearly basis. We have big plans for 2022. We have some projects that we've actually been working on for the past 6 months that have been gaining some traction here or there, but taking longer than we've expected, but in actually a pretty good way. Having said that, I think there might even be one last Patreon show of 2021 if you keep your ear to the ground and potentially DM us if you don't see it within the next 24 hours or so, because we'd have to meet that deadline of the end of the year. We are in BizX Magazine and bizxmagazine.com on all of your favorite social media and podcasting apps. We have a new article in BizX Magazine. It is our council report cards. For those of you who haven't heard the episode, you can check that out in print. And we have a new column that will be hitting BizX as well in February. That's more of a cue to our team here that we're going to have to figure out what it is we want to start the year out on. And Rose City Politics has been able to broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of LiUNA 625, Building Better Communities. We will dive into this one. This, as I said, is our year in review show. We went through the books. We pulled out the logs. We went through line by line. We pulled out the magnifying glasses to figure out which numbers stood out. And we wanted to put together a show that was really based on you, the listener. This is about your feedback in a sense. It's topic based, but we did some topics, more than others. Some were a whole show. So I want to bring in Doug right now, who is our resident tech specialist on the show. I only get to say that one 2 or 3 times before you start giving me that head shake that you can't stand. There it is. What was it that you pulled together for this list that we're going to be talking about of topics?
I went back through our year's episodes and tagged them based on the topics we discussed. So based on our show notes, an episode could have multiple tags, of course. Sometimes we talk about multiple topics, and once in a while, a topic could be tagged multiple times if it covered 2 different things. So we took all of those tags. We ended up with 33 topics that we talked about. Then ranked them, and it turned out that many ties and many overlaps between topics resulted in 10 broad topics that we covered this year.
10 broad topics. Some more broad than other ones. They focus in though on, as I was saying, the most pressing issues, I suppose, from your perspectives on it. And I don't think it would surprise anyone. We'll talk a little bit about the specific episodes in a bit, but I do want to dive in first. It won't surprise anyone here that the pandemic was the most all-encompassing topic that there was. This is a recurring theme from last year. I make the joke that I did not join this show to only talk about a pandemic, but going into year 3, and maybe we'll get some more topics beyond that. But it's interesting. We've seen a lot of things in the city, from whether it be vaccine mandates to stay-at-home orders lifted, restrictions lifted, to dancing being canceled, to the purchasing of new assets. It's been a year of this Hunger Games of trying to access vaccines and boosters and rapid tests as of late. Doug, I see that you're already unmuted, chomping at the bit here to get into it. So I'm going to come to you first. I want to hold on to a couple thoughts until we get this conversation going.
Sure. So in the self-reflection piece, thinking about our show, the pandemic obviously touches everything. It's the ground level reality that we're dealing with in so many topics. So it's not surprising that it dominated our conversation, as it should. I think it's an interesting thing for us to balance on the show that none of us are health experts. None of us know how infectious diseases really work. We're reliant on media reports. And I, for one, thought it was really important that when we touched on these topics, we brought that modesty to it and didn't become a show about the COVID-19. And I think we've achieved that. And I think that looking at this list of topics and subtopics that we covered under the umbrella of the pandemic, for the most part, I think that we stayed true to what we're meant to do on this show, which is talk about local politics. And, there are some important things to cover. In terms of the pandemic, there are many important things to talk about and many really grim things. But also a lot of the pandemic related political topics tended to be kind of surprisingly lighthearted. Vaccinations in the tunnel is a topic that we spent a ton of time on this show. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It was a pretty absurd political stunt, in my view, by Mayor Dilkins to propose and then push in local press and then in national press this idea of painting a line in the tunnel and administering shots there. In my opinion, there was never any there. And I think it sets the right tone in terms of thinking about how we talked about the pandemic and how it impacted this show, that probably the most time we spent talking about a pandemic topic was talking about this trivialization and politicization of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to frame it. I was going to respond to you when you had mentioned it. We spent an inordinate amount of time specifically on, whether it was the line in the tunnel or the wait list for it. It wasn't our choice. I mean, so kudos, I suppose, to the mayor's office. They made the choice. They put the political capital out there to try to garner these types of stories. And they were willing to take the good. They were willing to take the negative. And I say kudos very lightheartedly. I need to make clear for those who can't tell the sarcasm that should be dripping through. But it's been a weird year, but I echo your sentiment. We've done our best over this one and the last one to try to hone the content to not being about, the specific health side of it, reading out the numbers. We did that at the outset of last year. And it's not the place that we have. It's not serving the role that I think that we have here. We've got Pat though. So Pat, what's your take on it?
I thought it was really interesting when you put the research together and showed the numbers. First of all, I have to say, because I we don't get to really talk about this very often, but in some ways, it reminds me how many people do listen to the show. So I do want to say thanks to all of you who listen to us. It's a pretty terrific following, and I don't know what sense there is out there, like on social, and there's engagement, and some more than others, and even the Patreon subscribers who do not get their really great return on investment, but we appreciate that too, and our sponsors. I mean, LiUNA's been with us for so long. And so, at the end of the year, I do want to just, first of all, pause and thank everyone who tunes in. And no matter what, whether agree or disagree, I think we have, and also great guests. It's really great to bring on guests. And I noticed in some of these numbers, when we do have guests on, that there's a spike in the numbers, and that's a really cool thing. The thing that I also noticed about the list is that the pandemic really, there are a few topics that you might want to separate completely from the pandemic and say, okay, stand alone. If there was no pandemic happening, that would be a new story in itself. But how many other stories are impacted by the pandemic in some way, in some shape or form? I know that when we get, for example, I think we've listed housing, density, city building and development is number 7. Number 8, homelessness and the mission sort of combined there. But when we take a look at some of the other stories involving the pandemic, the response to the pandemic, the response really from a local perspective, a municipal perspective, and of course, that's what our show is really about, in terms of response in the community. And some of the issues that I think came starting last year, but even this year, particularly this year, sort of rose in our response to our community and all members of our community. I really think that that's been impacted by the pandemic, and we may not have seen that kind of response. I mean, opening up centers for people to go to, really moving quickly in order to move folks from the mission. If you remember when there was outbreak there, the response by, I know we talk about the politics on this show, and sometimes folks may blur the lines between what's happening politically and what happens from the administration perspective, and we'll definitely get into more of that, I'm sure. But sometimes we may not recognize, or we may not say it as often, but there's an entire bureaucracy of workers at the municipal level. And like frontline workers at hospitals and in healthcare, the response by those that work for the city deserve a shout out on a political show. I think at least at the end of the year, that we recognize, who's on the front lines and who does a lot of that work. I sort of, moved all over the place there, but those were some of the things that popped out when I took a look at these numbers and I took a look at those topics.
Well, thank you for that perspective, and I can I'll just go get rid of the thank yous that I had at the very end of the show.
Sorry, John, didn't mean to.
No, not at all. Not at all.
You can say it again.
It was genuine. Don, what have you got to say? I'm sure no thank yous to anyone's.
Well, Cooties is a terrible disease, John. It affects many, and we have to take it serious. I think what Doug said was, probably been the most interesting thing that it, none of us have gone through a real pandemic. This has been the biggest one. If you're of a certain age, like I am, the SARS thing happened back in the 90s when I was living in Toronto, and most of the cases actually were at the hospital up in Toronto. So, I kind of half-ass went through that. That was in my 20s. And, from a perspective standpoint, I guess when I was in my 20s and that came through, I didn't take it very serious either. So maybe some of the comments I've made about people not taking this serious are really just an age thing. Maybe you don't take these things as serious when you're younger, and the numbers for vaccination rates, and as we saw how the public responded, would probably be proof of that. Aside from that, before that, it was HIV and AIDS. When that came out, that was a horrible thing. It's still a horrible thing, but it seems, and again, it might just be my age, it seems like this has been hyper politicized. I think if we've learned anything in the past 2 years is that just because you're an elected politician doesn't mean you're the smartest person in the room, especially when it comes to medical issues and, things that are actually very, really, really important society wide, regardless what your political affiliations are. The mayor, I'm not gonna, the mayor's done as good a job as he can. He's done some stupid things, like the tunnel thing was absurd and ridiculous, but I think, he kind of pulled us through this. The health unit actually, I think, did a pretty good job, and it's still doing a pretty good job. So like, this is over. I made a kind of a stupid joke that got us a lot of hate mail. John brought up the Hunger Games, and I think my idea of archery classes in high school with shooting people with the vaccine was not a terrible idea. But so I think people have really gotten, this has become a very emotional issue for people. And unfortunately, it's become more than just a medical thing. And I think, if anything, the politicians really should have pumped more that, we should just be listening to the medical experts and not basing decisions about what we're going to do more on politics. And I think a lot of them have, and I think that's unfortunate. So, hopefully this comes to an end quick. I don't think it's ever going away, but again, I'm not a medical professional. I just play one on the internet. So we'll see how things go, and hopefully things get sorted out soon.
Well, I spent all the niceness that I had pre-dawn, and now I'm going to jump in post-dawn.
There you go. Knock yourself out.
And hit the mayor because I'm not sure, how bad.
It has been 12 minutes, folks. We are into this show.
I'm not sure. I'm still regretting the grade I gave him in BizX. And now that I've had a chance to actually do an actual year in review by looking at these topics, even more so. So here we are. Let's start there. I don't know. I mean, what you would have to do, short of a scandal, which I admit we have not had. But when I couple how he's actually performed in response to the pandemic, coupled with what we've referred to regularly on this show, which is the heightened sort of media roadshow and the marketing that comes out of the mayor's office. When you strip away all that stuff and you really take a look at the mayor's leadership, and I'm only saying this now because John mentioned it, so I'm jumping in on that level at that point. Well, and we don't even have to go to last year when he canceled transit. Let's take a look at how that whole vaccine thing started in the tunnel. And I still maintain that all those antics were started because he needed to divert attention, that he went over to the States. And I know that there's another context and bullshit and privacy and family members and all that nonsense. But let's face it, that whole story stunk. Okay. And then he came back and then he said, he did not get he did not get vaccinated. And we still don't understand why when he had the opportunity to do it. And then let's not forget that he then questioned whether people should mix and match, right? And all sorts of nonsense came out of this mayor. I'm sorry, in response to the pandemic, let alone, I mean, no wonder it's one of our top stories. Forget, not the healthcare issue, but the whole vaccination and every other day or every day there being a news story and hitting up the fed, and how he sort of trashes the federal government and was all so nice with the provincial government, all the political garbage. When you really strip away what was happening and you took a look at him, I'm not sure I can give credit to him that he, what can I say? He was the mayor during the pandemic. Did he do a particularly good job? Point out what exactly he did that was unique to him, that was so good.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Pat. I think it's worth zooming out and looking at the political leaders at all levels and how they've handled the pandemic. I don't think that anyone at the federal or provincial or municipal level is free of engaging in a bit of politicization of this pandemic at this point, after a couple of years of enduring it. I think everyone did some maneuvering. You can't argue, I think, that the federal government, the Liberals, didn't deploy certain elements of the pandemic to their advantage in the election, particularly when the anti-vaxxer protests happened at some campaign events. You look at Premier Ford, who has really struggled in this pandemic, and I think he's really struggled because his coalition of supporters and electors is not very friendly to a public health solution to the pandemic, and I think the provincial government has really struggled there. And Drew Dilkens doesn't have that challenge. And yet, I think in many ways, he struggled in this pandemic as well. If it wasn't for the fact that he has a pretty compliant media, a pretty supportive media environment, I think he would have struggled a whole lot more. There were a lot of good questions to ask about his trip to the US, but I agree with you, Pat. I think that he created a distraction, created a kind of a shiny object to distract everyone from that, and the press followed him there. And so that was, I think, a successful operation. The AM 800 comments that you made, or that the mayor made, that you mentioned, Pat, about mixing doses, I think that item, along with, I think, some pretty irresponsible stuff about vaccine supply early in the year, to me, those are the biggest impacts that Drew Dilkens as mayor had on the pandemic and how its course went locally. And I think that that impact was to trivialize it, to politicize it, and to create some distractions from the good and important work that was really being done by frontline workers, by our hospital systems, and by the local public health unit. Those are, to me, those are the folks who, to varying degrees, deserve the kudos for managing this pandemic effectively, particularly to the health unit and their partners in the hospital system in terms of the vaccine rollout. You may not remember, there were some intimations that the WICHU was not going to be able to handle vaccinations, that there wasn't a plan, that we weren't sure why there wasn't a plan for the vaccination rollout, and we were very concerned about this. Think about what that is. There was no there. The rollout went great. Vaccinations were, it was a fantastic process. I just got my booster shot at the Sears clinic, and it was incredible. The logistics have been handled great by Windsor Regional Hospital, and particularly by the health unit. So what purpose did it serve? How did it help anybody to undermine confidence in our health unit's ability to do their primary function, which is to get people vaccinated and protect public health? What good did it do? How did it help the community? I would argue that Mayor Dilkens' approach to the pandemic has been unnecessarily cynical and self-interested, and really, in comparison to the I think much better job with a more difficult hand that the Premier of this province and the Prime Minister of this country did.
I know that you had your hand up there, John, and I don't know if that's where you were going to go as well. And I think Doug did it at least preemptively, and that's I'll follow up with that. That's exactly what you made me think of as you were starting to discuss it. Actually, the undermining of the health unit and the leadership at the health unit, in fact, and so. That's not leadership at the municipal level when you've got that happening. So there's certainly a lot of room for criticism. And when you take a look at it again, stripping all those things away, what you see is some pretty crass politicization of certain events. How we respond, what our mayor thinks of the federal government's pretty clear. What our mayor thinks of the provincial leadership is very clear, and why that is. And we'll see some more coming out, I think, even before the end of the year, in terms of what he thinks the top things were for our community in the last year, and looking ahead into 2022, despite some really concerning aspects of what might happen with Stellantis And in fact, going all the way back to the very beginning of this particular mandate post-election of his, and that would be economic diversification. And as we roll into what is going to be an election year in 2022, but in fact, tying it back to the pandemic, when you take a look at, what can you say he really did? Well, he was there. And a lot of it is smoke and mirrors, but when you really dig into it, in fact, I think that we managed this despite him rather than because of him.
Agreed with that. Yeah, despite him. Let's move on then to the second topic here. To be honest, there's so much more that we can say about any one specific thing, especially as it's encompassing as that. But let's talk, I suppose, about amenities and asset development. And Pat, I want to bring your voice into this one because we were talking earlier in our pre-chat about a different topic, but there's an overlap here about, what our spending has been this year, which is obviously sort of where this conversation encompasses. So I was hoping to get your perspective and to do a bit of a, looking back at your review of what's been done, what's been discussed, and if you would be so willing to do a contrast to what the budget brought, I suppose, sort of mix the two.
I'm not really sure I'm getting what you're asking of me. Just want to clarify that because I'm about to go off.
Go off. I think go off then is the angle that I want from it. I mean, your perspective on where we stand then. I mean, the listeners, they obviously showed us that in regards to amenities and asset development is what they were focusing in on through their listen. So what's your take on what we've discussed in the past year of that?
Well, when I take a look at our list as number 2, and when I see, amenities and asset development, I do see there, first of all, that Windsor Works is in there and the budget is in there, right? So those are really big and broad topics. And so immediately when, the fact that these were coupled together on our list as listeners tuning in to these particular topics, the first thing that jumps out at me is to what extent does this budget that we just passed recently reflect the willingness to implement the Windsor Works report. And so I find that particularly interesting. I don't know, to what extent. I think if housing is in there, I think that there is good news that there will be an investment in housing, in particular in units that needed to be maintained and hadn't been maintained for many, many years, and building new ones in this community. I don't want to take away from the fact that is really good news and definitely where we need to be moving to. Although I would also say that many, many years of holding the line on taxes was the reason why we were so desperately and in critical situations here locally, and why finally, we're still behind, and the reason we're behind is because we don't maintain, and we see that. So there's a lot of different things that I'm taking a look at this from a variety of perspectives. I think there have been some good things that are coming forward. But at the same time, there are reasons why we were in kind of desperate situations. I don't know if amenities and asset development is part of this, but I think another really good thing that's happened this year is that no longer will vacant commercial buildings get a tax break. And I think that they were waiting on the provincial government to actually do that. And finally, it's going to be implemented. So I think that there are some things that we're seeing are incentivizing and revitalizing essentially infrastructure development, construction, and essentially overall investments that we're going to be seeing and are going to be continuing to happen, I think.
So I'll weigh in on this. On the topic of asset management and amenities, I think that it's natural that this is our number 2 topic, because it's so much of what municipal spending is, and so much of what municipal politics is it comes down to how do we divide the pie when it comes to making investments in assets, and which investments should we prioritize. That is a huge part of budget making. What so I think to some extent this was driven by the media cycle, and it's driven by the way information about the municipal priorities are disseminated in Windsor. These items get dropped strategically. They get debated, they get a bit of media attention, and then we move on. And I think that's a reason why we talk so much about this particular topic. But I also, and I know that the budget is going to come up a little bit later, but I do think these two things are really tied together. And the piece that I want to bring out now is that in terms of that connection is how difficult it really is for an average resident of Windsor to understand how money is spent, what each individual investment means in the grand scheme of things, and where all these dollars come from and are going. I think that speaks to the weakness of our budget process in terms of being a tool that communicates effectively how money is spent and how it's distributed. When a news item comes up about this or that amenity, the trolley, the canopy downtown by the river, 80 knocks, et cetera, you get to hear about big round numbers. Some of those numbers, some of those tens of millions are earmarked for 5 years down the road or several years down the road. That's not all this year's money. And sometimes there are investments from upper tier governments wrapped up in that. And it's all very difficult to, I think, for the average citizen to understand how all these things fit into the grand scheme of things. You know, one of the things that I would love to see media do is provide a little bit of context when they talk about this type of thing. So for instance, Mayor Dilkens did a tour relatively recently talking about investments in parks, and they did little press releases about, making new paths in certain parks, and they did media ops, and the famous Dilkens podium was part of those. But then the reality of the situation is that the overall investment is not more. You know, the overall investment in parks and recreation, those investments were being made for very particular purposes. My understanding is that the road or the widening of paths in parks was being done to make it more easy for particular maintenance vehicles to get around in the parks. So we had a spend of money on a very specific purpose. And Mayor Dilkens or his office looked at that and said, hey, we can make some hay out of that. And the media runs with it, but we don't get the context provided to us that would help us to understand the bigger picture. And I think that that's really unfortunate.
To be fair, they don't get the context either. And they're chasing. They're. Hey, I'm just saying.
I don't know how.
I know it's. I know it's
ask the questions,
I know it's
John.
their job. Oh, they can ask the questions for sure. But do you think that the responses are going to be print worthy?
I don't know until you ask. How do you know?
Yeah, I think I agree.
That's a very, very good point.
It has to be asked. It has to be asked. And he already has the media show happening right out of the mayor's office. We don't need the media being an arm of that. That's what the media is for. That's how democracy works, for the very reasons that Doug said. For the most part, we're really busy in our lives as citizens, and we don't have time to look into it or ask these questions. So that's what the media is there to do. What's really interesting, Doug, about that in terms of the investment by other levels of government, I'm going to tie it in again to what I think has been blatant sort of politicizing, and by that I mean partisan politics on the part of the mayor in the last few years in particular. But when we take a look, and I know he's doing his top 10 list right now, and we haven't gotten to see his the pictures that are coming out for numbers 2 and number 1. But I did notice, for example, that which is the one, number 8 was the Ojibwe National Urban Park. And in the statement that he makes on Twitter, he says, he refers to the statement of collaboration, quote unquote, with the government. Well, which government? your government? Was it the provincial government? Was it the federal government? Now I'm just going to, guess, because it says Ojibwe National Urban Park. So I'm going to have to maybe connect my own dots there. I have no doubt when his number one comes out, well, we've got two left. I'm going to put my money that number one is the moving to stage 2 and the funding for the mega hospital. And having said that, is he going to refer to the government there too, or is it going to be a little bit more specific on his buddies there? So again, these are the little things that when you take a look and pause and just sort of really look at it, you see it for what it is. And actually, once you see it, you really can't not see it.
Don, let's bring you into this.
Well, Cooties is a terrible thing, John. And
That was the scotch, though.
sorry, I'm sick. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, I guess on this topic, if anything good came from this pandemic, and I don't think anything good has come from this pandemic, it is kind of shined a light on the things we've been neglecting federally, provincially, and municipally for years and years. Housing's been a big issue. Homelessness is a big issue. Drug addictions are a big issue. There's a lot of big issues that probably wouldn't have got the attention they got and the money they're getting now if it wasn't for the situation that we're in. Let's face it, the feds have been throwing money around like it's water, and rightfully so. I mean, you had to support the people out there because you can't just have people dying on the streets. There is going to be a question at some point, how are we going to pay for all this stuff? And that's going to come up down the line, hopefully once this is over. The housing situation is kind of brought up in this topic, and obviously I'm very acutely aware of what's going on there. We've had big influxes of people moving from big cities to smaller cities. Affordability has become an issue, and that is various levels of government. I mean, interest rates are basically zero these days. And, that was, it was probably the right thing to do, just to make sure, real estate and housing is a huge, huge part of the Canadian economy, whether you like us realtors or not. So, it helped sustain things and keep things going. We couldn't just let the world collapse. But like I say, there's going to be a point at some point we have to figure out, okay, we got to turn the taps off or figure out how we're going to pay for all this stuff. I think the mayor's dog and pony show he's been doing for the last few months, where every new road is now an international greatest road on the entire planet. And, something that's going to draw tourism here. We're all going to go to Cabana Road and just lick the
world class.
World class. That's what it was. Yeah, we got world class intersections. So, I mean, it's already becoming, we're in campaign season already for the next election. Let's not kid ourselves. I think going back to what we were talking with on the first topic, what's been upsetting about this whole thing is at the end of the day, the pandemic started out like it did, even from a provincial level, the province and the feds, we're going to work on this together. I was actually impressed with how they were, but the longer this went on, the more politics came out. And at the end of the day, politicians are going to, that's all that really matters to them. So I think it's unfortunate. Housing is going to continue to be a big issue even after this is gone. And hopefully, the various levels of governments have figured out that, it's important. You can't just have people living on the street or people living in people's basements. You need to supply housing. If there's going to be, an influx of immigrants and people moving from other cities, it's got to be something that bounces around. And the private sector can't do everything. I mean, that's just the reality of it. The private sector is not going to build low-income housing. They're just not going to. So yeah, there's a lot of issues with that. What bothers me a bit, and I'm sure this will be more, about the budget topic, what I think we're going to next is, on the municipal level, at the end of the day, the mayor and whole council, I'm not giving anybody any slack on this. At the end of the day, they just can't avoid those bright, shiny objects that they want to spend a lot of money on. And those things, I've talked about it on the last few shows, even when Reno show, which was very, I said, look, dude, it's priorities. It's all priorities. The money's there. It's just, you got to decide what you want to spend it on. And for some reason, since the pandemic, so we've talked about 80 knocks, we've talked about $23 million to cover the stage downtown. There's been tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars in projects that they just can't let go of for whatever reason and focus on what's really important. And what's really important to me right now, and I think to a lot of people, is, housing's a huge issue for people. Homelessness is a huge issue. Addiction issues are a big problem, which all falls under the healthcare thing. So, that's where, that's what bothers me. I mean, look, a perfect example, Fred Francis is ranting on in the newspaper about how Roseland is running a profit this year. even though it's basically been closed. Well, if that's the case, let's close it forever and think of all the money we'll make. I mean, he's factoring in federal money grants as profit money. And that's how stupid it's become, where politicians municipally think that we're all idiots and can't figure out basic math. And it's almost insulting when stuff like that comes out, but they can't get away from this. At the end of the day, that's who they are. And, we don't really realize until something bad and major globally happens that, there's a lot of idiots running this country and running the city. It's unfortunate.
Well, it's like Adventure Bay, right? And
yeah, we spent $1 million on a new stupid slide, and we didn't do $1 million new transit route that would help kids get back and forth to school and, people get across the city. And the rationale, but behind that was, well, I can get in my car and drive across town in 15 minutes. Like, that was seriously what he said. So he has no concept that not everybody is driving a giant truck like I am, or has 13 cars in their garage. There's actually people who can't afford to do that. And unfortunately, he doesn't run in those circles. So he doesn't understand what people are going through. He has no concept of what a lot of people are going through in this city. But he gets elected. So I guess, maybe it's our own fault.
I know this, I don't even know if this was on our list, but this does remind me of the show that we did for when Chris Vanderdolen had his, 15 minutes this year. And what Don reminds me of is that people don't know until it impacts them. If you remember, that's, he made some awful comments about COVID, what he called it. And then he got it, and then he wouldn't wish it on his worst enemy, some of which may be on the show right now, but that's beside the point. And so in essence, this really bothers me about politicians, and I'm not going to paint them all with the same brush as Don has, only because I have to distinguish myself from what Don says. And that's, this is where somebody who's elected to public office and does not have to be in that situation to understand the importance of why we need to invest in whether it's because I ride transit or not, whether it's because I need public housing or not, whether it's because I need health care or not, whether it's because I need mental health care services or not. The importance of how we invest in those things, I don't think we have to wait until they impact our families. And frankly, if there's a politician that only gets it after that, screw you. That's the problem. And I don't think that if you take a look at our council table, actually, that is what's happening by everyone around that council table. And in fact, I think that, and not to repeat other shows, but in essence, I think you can actually, there's your dividing line. The councillors and elected officials who actually care, even though it may not impact them personally, but because they get it.
I think you're still giving a little too much credit to Councillor Vanderdolen, because he never apologized for what he said. He doubled down. He said it was a really bad virus, but he stood by his comments about where it came from and its origins like that. So I like that, though. Screw you. That's good. Let's roll right on to transit. I don't think there's any surprise here that this is a topic that came up. We saw the resumption of full service, which again, we're following up from the total shutdown of it, which was a year ago, where service only began to resume from there. I suppose it would have been really interesting to have been able to watch how that decision progressed, how long it would have taken to get to full service. Doug, I want to bring you in first before we start talking about some of the outcomes of transit. Maybe you'll touch upon it first, but I know that you had said you had some broad points that you wanted to bring up specifically.
Thanks, John. Yeah, the transit issue is one that I think is really interesting. There's no question that there are increasing voices asking, demanding better transit service in this city. Folks are getting more organized. We had Activate Transit Windsor Essex on the show to talk about that. They were active during the city budget process. But I want to suggest something to you, and it goes back to the cancellation of transit service by Mayor Dilkens last year. I don't think that that was a move that was done by design. I think that that move was done as a knee-jerk reaction. Potentially, we've got to do something, and picking something that would be bold, would be politically viable, which obviously Mayor Dilkens does not see users of transit as an important interest group for him to cultivate. But I think when the response happened to it, when there was a response that came from Councillor Bordelon and others in the city about the cancellation of transit service, I think that a political idea started to crystallize in the mayor's office. And I think that they being the staff who work with the mayor and the mayor himself, I think that they have decided that transit is a great issue to kind of use and put forward. And when you think about the way that transit service was deprioritized in the city budget, I don't think there's any other way that you can put that when you unanimously support a transit master plan with timelines. And then during the budget process, the council collectively blinks and decides not to proceed with the plan that they unanimously endorsed. I do think that there's something there, and I think that the mayor calculates that transit is not a winning issue. That the more outraged folks get about transit, and the more noise that politicians who may oppose him or may take a different view, the more they're talking about transit, the more they are losing Joe and Jane on Askin Avenue. And I think there's some merit to that calculation. And to some extent, if you are, a supporter of better transit service, you are pushing for better transit service, you're kind of stuck. Because this is not an issue that you're choosing to play politics on. This is an issue that really matters to your constituents, to the people who you represent, and you've got to just keep going after it, whether or not it is quote unquote a political winner. And I think that that's really interesting. I'm not so sure I agree with the calculation. I'm not so sure that the screw people who take the bus is a very viable message. I don't think it's going to make Windsorites feel good about themselves, but I do think that there is a calculation there, and the calculation is that transit can be sacrificed. Transit can be sacrificed in order to create political fights on the ground of the mayor's choosing.
So I think that in some ways that calculation distinguishes whether the mayor thinks he's running a big town or a small city, depending on what you look at it. And I think that, communities, when you take a look at small communities, towns, if you will, some of the bedroom communities, even in our own region, when you take a look at their need for transit versus what a city's need for public transit is, that's really where some of that dividing line goes. And I don't think he can make up his mind. I don't think he realizes that in many ways the choices that he makes politically don't align with the fact that he's running a city. And to me, that was no place clearer than when he did in fact announce that he was shutting down transit. He strutted that around, and in fact he said we are the first city to do it. If you remember, he was leading that, and he kind of did one of these, and he looked behind, and no other municipality, no other big city in Canada did it to follow. So he was leading nothing. And I think he was out of step with the understanding of mayors of big cities and of cities, let me just say cities, who understand the importance of transit in their community, even if they drive their car and get somewhere in 15 minutes.
Essential workers are the most essential to us all. We can't have them not being at work, which is why they'll find their own gosh darn way to work when we have to shut down transit. Pat, I think you made a really really good point there with that. Doug, I wanted to follow up on one point as well with this idea of when it was shut down. I think it gave a bit of some cover and fodder, to use that terminology that we've been seeing here leading up to the budget, of the subsidization of transit, being able to really put it on the attack when we don't talk about the fact that, we're subsidizing Roseland or we're subsidizing Adventure Bay, when that's the real subsidization that's going on in the community here. Transit is an essential service. It's been proven it's an essential service through his own walk back, having to, coyly try to make it seem like it wasn't one of the biggest mistakes of Canadian mayors of this year in the pandemic. That should be an episode unto of itself, contrasting every mayor's response with what Mayor Drew Dilkens did. Try to get a comment from any of them. But I thought you also hit an interesting point, Pat. Mayor Dilkens is missing out on the ideal opportunity of being a sub-tier mayor with the talk show. That's the ideal division of the time for him, right?
So I think that's possibly a better use of Mayor Dilkens' talents. I think it's a really interesting point that Pat raises about the what are your ambitions? What do you want to be? And sometimes I get the feeling that Drew Dilkens would be a lot happier as mayor of Tecumseh than he is as mayor of Windsor, because of where his concerns are and who he sees as his core constituency. But I wanted to come back to this, because I think that transit is a really important thing in our community, and it's something that for a long time was dismissed and poo-pooed and treated as kind of the redheaded stepchild of Windsor City Services. And I don't think that is quite in tune with how the rising generation sees the things that they want for their city, and it's also not in tune with what we heard from Windsor Works. I really think that there are attitudes that Mayor Dilkens brings out that from time to time that seem like a relic of the 1990s more than they do as policies for the 2020s. Canceling transit was, if you think back to the flood in 2017, and Mayor Dilkens got a lot of mileage out of looking very leaderly, wearing his City of Windsor windbreaker in the Emergency Response Center. And to some extent, I think that canceling transit was his windbreaker of 2020. He tried that on and he felt that it made him look and feel more mayoral. So just like wearing the windbreaker everywhere afterwards, or like Rudy Giuliani not being able to order his breakfast without saying 9/11 4 times. I think that Mayor Dilkens kind of fell in love with the idea of being the guy who canceled transit. And just to go back to what Pat was saying earlier about the way that the vaccine in the tunnel crazy policy idea evolved out of an embarrassment and a miscalculation by Mayor Dilkens, I think that his current desire to use transit as kind of a political whipping boy is very similar in that vein. Canceling transit was a bad, dumb idea that turned out to, need to be reversed, and nobody else followed suit. So now we're going to double down, and now we're going to continue to wear that windbreaker as we move into 2021 and try to get as much mileage out of it as we can.
Well, I guess I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian point on this, because when this happened, I didn't think canceling transit was a bad idea. And my rationale for this, I guess this goes back to, I think politicians play politics even in the worst of times. The mayor just blatantly said, I'm canceling transit for X, Y, and Z. You had Councillor Bordelin, and I'm sure there were some others going, calling the mayor to task on this. And so I get the perspective I will go from. Look, I have an old friend of mine, went to high school with, still talk with him randomly. He's a Windsor Transit bus driver. I spoke to him at this time. And his comment was, I'm more than happy to drive the bus, but I'm not going to die for it. And between the bickering of canceling transit and we shouldn't cancel transit, the conversation got lost is how do we protect the drivers? Because there was no solution brought by anybody, including the union, including Councillor Borland, including the mayor, about how do we keep the drivers safe from a virus that's going around we know very little about, and at the time obviously had no vaccines for. And we shouldn't have sacrificed the drivers or risked the drivers' health to send them out there just to keep the buses running. And that's my opinion. And I agree with that. They could have done it if they would have just taken, look, what do we need to do to protect the drivers? Whether it's putting up barriers, whatever the case was, that's for people smarter than me. The point is nobody was talking about that. The only conversation they were having is this is bad, this is good, or vice versa. If you're on their side, this guy's bad or this guy's good. At the end of the day, drivers had to be protected. That's their job. We wouldn't send someone out, weed whacking, the parks with no safety boots on or goggles at the time or anytime. So the safety of the drivers had to be the priority, and politics got in the way, and they ended up fighting over politics instead of trying to find a solution. And that goes to the union too. They were all part of this too. So there's enough blame to go around. They were all wrong in my opinion, but at the end of the day, if you're not going to protect the drivers, you shouldn't send them out there. And the mayor basically said, yeah, I'm not going to send them out there, but also didn't try to come up with any solution. And I think that's where the politics comes in on this.
Well, I know you want to move on, John, and I just can't. I have to jump in here for a minute.
At final words.
Well,
That's
explain
not
to
gonna
me
happen.
then,
Nope.
Don, why it took a year and a half for service to resume, full service to resume. It didn't happen until September 2021. Explain to me how it was okay to, try to have buses be part of a vaccination center. In other words, putting unvaccinated people on a bus. Explain to me how any of that makes sense. I'm hearing what you're saying, which is basically apologizing for the mayor's stupidity, and there may have been something there, but in terms of the health and safety of workers. But we also know that there were a lot of what we call essential workers that needed to get to their jobs. And that's why it's public transit. And to me, that is the responsibility of those who oversee it, and how to manage it. And of course, take a look for the safety of all their employees, but also delivering the service that there had to be. By the same logic, we could have closed out hospitals too. But anyway.
Sure. And I'm not apologizing for what the mayor did. I think it was stupid, but there's enough blame to go around because politics got involved in this. Everybody got into a pissing match, and no one was coming up with any solutions about how to protect the health and safety of the people driving those buses. So that's my point. And rightfully so. If you can't come up with a solution, then they shouldn't have to go put themselves in that situation.
Yeah. Well, a lot of other cities did it.
Yeah, and the drivers died. There was a driver in London who died from it. Are we willing to sacrifice them just because politics gets in the way of things? Anyway, go ahead, John, before Cooties comes back into the conversation.
Let's move on. Topics 4 and 5, very similar. We'll group them together for the sake of moving along this conversation.
There's a theme there, by the way.
2021 budget, Windsor Works, automotive, diversification. We've already talked a lot about these issues already. They've popped up. Doug, I'm going to come to you first on this one in a hopes of trying to crystallize where we were going with it.
Sure. Thanks, John. So Windsor Works and diversification, I picked that out as the topic that was, I think, the most important topic that we talked about in terms of politics. Obviously, there are other issues that are very important. I certainly don't want to slight any of the critical issues that we talked about, but this is one that's really interesting to me because I think it's very much in the purview of municipal government. Obviously the budget is, but also I think trying to think about who we are as a city and what kind of city we want to be. This is the essence of municipal government and making the city what its residents want it to be. And I think that there's a real challenge on diversification of the economy, and you can see that in the way that it's been handled by some of the agencies who, like Invest Windsor Essex, who work on this file, and that is that everything has to, in some way, genuflect to the auto industry. Whether it is the right path for us to take or the best path, I think gets a little bit lost, because you can't ignore that elephant in the room of the thousands of people who work in the auto industry in Windsor, and who have emotional feelings that are really important to them about what it means and the meaning of the auto industry to the city, versus what the auto industry will mean to Windsor in 2050 or 2060, and I think those are the things that we should be grappling with, but we're thinking about the Windsor of 1975 and not really effectively moving forward. And it ties to the budget, because Mayor Dilkens actually made that connection explicit when he talked about transit as though it were somehow an attack on cars to want better mobility for people who don't own them. And I think that was really telling. That was a moment, as I said before, I don't think that was a scripted moment. I think that was a moment where Mayor Dilkens was letting a little bit of frustration out, and perhaps letting some partially baked thoughts out into the public debate. When we talk about diversifying our economy, or we talk about what kind of city that we want, we are always constrained, because there is this fear and concern that if you don't provide enough space for the auto industry to be the most important thing in Windsor now and forever, that you're going to get pushback and opposition that you don't want. I don't disagree that leveraging the biggest private sector industry in the region is smart in terms of our diversification strategy. But what I don't see is an actual vision for what the future of our economy looks like. Whether it makes sense to continue to invest in an industry that is seeing marginal growth, if any, in the 21st century, a sunset industry where you expect to see consolidation and an overall diminishment in global terms in auto manufacturing over the next decade, 2 decades, whatever. I'm not sure it makes sense for us to continue to tie our identity to it, but I think there's a political fear that not being seen to center the auto industry makes you vulnerable. And I think that fear and perhaps political cowardice and people like the mayor and like Invest Windsor Essex, their lack of confidence in their ability to sell a vision of the future that doesn't pander to the city of the past, I think is actually impacting and distorting our efforts in this direction. And I'm really worried about it.
Yeah, I guess, you know what, I agree with Doug, and I think it's unfortunate that the people who are in power really can't see anything bigger than just, slapping cars together, which, somebody's got to do it, so fine. I think what we're missing out on, look, cars aren't going anywhere, vehicles aren't going anywhere, but it's how we see ourselves in that industry is the problem. The problem is, it seems like the mayor and the people who are in charge of quote unquote economic diversification, which has turned into just a catchphrase for the last 15 years around here, is, look, a good friend of mine is an engineer and designer over at FCA in the States. And what he says, which is really important to understand, is cars aren't just cars anymore. Cars are just mobile computers. They're high-tech machines now. And the problem I've always had with the politicians and even the economic development people here is we can't see past just putting them together. We can't see about designing them. We can't see about the automation aspect of it. We can't see about, designing chips and things that do all, things that are for people much smarter than I, and Doug obviously knows a lot more about, the tech industry than I do, but that's what cars are. Cars are technological beasts now. And our only perception to how we can participate in this industry is we're going to put tires on these cars, or we're going to slap the parts together instead of designing the parts for these cars. And I think that's where we're lacking in vision for the area. Economic diversification doesn't mean you have to walk away from autos, but it does mean you have to walk away from our total concept of what we can participate in is just putting them together, because that's a no-win situation. Because we've seen, I've been back in Windsor for 22 years now, and how many plants that were here 22 years ago are not here anymore. We're down to one basically. And that one's even on shaky ground at times, even though I'm pretty sure there's a third shift going to be brought back and a new vehicle going in there. But we see with investments the auto companies are making, the battery plants and things like that for the electric vehicles are going to places like Tennessee, and a lot of it's, lower cost, lower labor costs. And those are the assembly jobs. Those are the ones we're fighting for. We're trying to fight for the lowest fruit on this tree. And, there's just no vision or perception that we can be anything but the lowest fruit on the lowest branch of that tree. And it's because of our leadership. They can't see anything different. And maybe it's because it doesn't affect them. I mean, how many people working, aside from Councillor Holt, how many people in council or in the economic development portion have worked in the auto industry? They don't know what's going on over there. The biggest joke I remember was when, this was years ago, the mayor said in the newspaper, well, we, auto mobility or self-driving cars, and that we don't want to focus on that. We want to be the people who put them together. And that to this day has stuck with me, of that is his perception of Windsor, is we are just the lowest branch on the lowest tree, the simplest job in that whole chain. And he doesn't see things any different. And I think that's going to be an ongoing problem if we continue to elect leaders who can't see past just, I don't want to say anything bad about people who assemble cars, but that's the lowest tier of what you can do with vehicles these days. And that's all we focus on. Let's try to get another plant. We get pissed off because Volkswagen doesn't build an assembly plant here. I mean, is that really what we're going for? Is that it?
So one of the times that I just want to pick up on some stuff Don talked about. One of the times that I got called a naysayer in recent memory was when I was engaging in critique around Windsor's tech industry, in particular, talking about the a report. I'm trying to recall the name of the report, but talking about a report in terms of the gender divide in the tech workforce in Windsor, issues of compensation for women in tech in Windsor. And I have to say that I've been working on this file pretty intimately. Obviously, this is my career. I've been in this industry for a couple of decades now, but for the past 10 years, I've been working pretty intimately on trying to help my community as best I can to move forward on tech, to bring tech people together, to make Windsor a better place for tech workers. And it frustrates me so much that we have stagnated on this file. Like, we have stagnated for a decade on tech, while we have seen peer communities elsewhere in Southwestern Ontario and across Canada figure it out, get some traction and move things forward. Even London, which is not a tech city, has started to really outstrip us in terms of our performance on this file. Now we get to auto mobility. Now we get to Windsor Works, and tech is essential. It's an essential component of moving things forward, just as Don has alluded to, in terms of moving Windsor's investment in auto up the value chain and to higher value work, which we have to do. The reason why it's so hard to get an assembly plant in Windsor is that it is no longer high value work to work on assembly. There are lots of places in this world, and you can like it or not like it or whatever, where you can get a unit of equivalent value of work in terms of putting stuff together for a lot cheaper than you can get it in Windsor. So if we're going to justify high wages, if we're going to justify investment in education, if we're going to justify the lifestyle that we want to have as Canadians, as Ontarians, as Windsorites, then we have to climb that value chain. But we haven't done the work. We haven't done the work over the past decade. And there is in Windsor, there is a resistance and a dismissal of the tech industry and of tech people that is cultural, and I think is very damaging to our community. When you look at people who are leaders in quote unquote leaders in tech in Windsor, when you look at people who are working on this, ask yourself, and I don't mean to be a gatekeeper, but ask yourself, okay, well, what is their industry knowledge? What is their experience? How do they know? What time have they spent in the trenches? I'm not saying that you can't be an effective leader if you have never written a line of code or whatever metric that you want to use, but it sure helps. And I think it sure says a lot about this community and the esteem we hold technical workers in, which to me is the core of the problem, that we haven't actually ever solicited the ideas and the needs of tech workers themselves. We keep talking about it. Windsor Works spends pages and pages and pages talking about all the things that we need to do to attract tech workers, but based on surveys of the general population, based on reports from other jurisdictions. What about just talking to the tech workers in Windsor? What about getting them to tell you what it would take to make Windsor a more viable place to make a life and career? We would be a hell of a lot further forward if we had done that. Combining that with this moment of opportunity that we have because of the influx of international students that have come to Windsor, to the college and the university, and the corresponding increase in technical education, we are turning out more capable tech grads than we ever have before, and we still don't have jobs for them. That's a problem. That's a problem. And it doesn't matter how many automobility hashtags you slap all over this town, until you get to the actual goddamn problems that are holding us back, you are not going to solve them.
Doug,
Yeah.
have you considered moving, I don't know, like maybe to the United Kingdom, launching a consulting firm, and maybe just recommending speaking with local tech workers? That might be a better inroad.
I just haven't gone to enough Christmas parties at 10 Downing Street in order to be considered an expert on what Windsor needs.
You look like a Boris Johnson fan, Doug. I really picture you hanging out.
I envy his hair. That's about it.
Well, get in line, my friend. Look at this.
Nice comb over.
You okay, Don?
The report was the Brookfield Institute's report, and the data was Stats Canada data in that report that you mentioned, Doug. And I think that in some ways, all of that leads to Invest Windsor Essex, which I know is going to be on our list at some point. So I'll leave it there. But when we talk about economic diversification, everything from the mayor's inaugural address all the way down to where we are right now, heading into an election year, and the Development Commission, however they want to rebrand, and the role that everyone plays in this small town city of ours, and whose fingers are on the keys of where this goes.
Don is afraid that he's getting some pushback for his comments in the form of a targeted microquake.
Someone either just bombed my house or we had an earthquake, one or the other. So, or I've had too much whiskey and not enough tea. So,
oh no, it's the Cooties symptoms locking in again.
I'm taking it for medical reasons, John. That's all.
Really, really good points that you raised there, Doug. It's always great when you do go on a little one of your soliloquies about the state of the industry and specifically from your perspective, because, it's coming from a very educated place. It's not me just trying to yammer off about things. It's someone who literally does this on a daily basis. And, it matters to have that perspective specifically. So thank you for that. Let's move on now. We're going to try to shift up this format a little bit. We're talking about a Running the City segment. Surprisingly, coming up tied together for I think it's like a 5 and 6 or 6 and 7 is Mayor Dilkins and our new CAO. So it made sense to group them together, and a lot of this was because of us. We, as we talked about at the top, we decided to focus a lot on these issues. So it comes down to, what we're serving up for dinner. if there's only meatloaf and lasagna, you can't be too surprised that a lot of people are liking lasagna. I don't like meatloaf personally, so that would be the reason why I lean one way or the other. Pat, let's start off with you on just this idea here. I think that maybe you can be revved up by just starting out.
So the CAO has certainly made his presence known in this city. A lot of what we point out on the show involving the mayor's media tour, all of that happens on social media, all those things coming out of the mayor's office came last year. And so this year was really interesting to see the difference between the chief of staff and now the CAO. These are pretty big changes, two different bodies, if you will, but really sort of an interesting way to see the impact. Of course, the CEO has a much bigger impact, or should have a much bigger impact than the chief of staff. But what's interesting is that year of a head start that the new mayor's chief of staff has had, I guess, I mean, at what point is he no longer the new one? I don't know. But, how much of a presence he's had in terms of the quotes and things is really interesting, given where we're seeing sort of the new CAO come in this year. I've already talked about, and I know there's been some criticism lately, particularly just before the budget or during the budget process, I think from others, but I still have a lot of goodwill towards this new CAO in terms of what I like. I guess what concerns me, I think, is probably for those of us that watch it very closely is how committed he is to this community, or whether this is, a sort of a step along his own path. Because those of us that live here love it here. And the reason we talk about, municipal politics every week, lest it gets lost on everyone, is because we love this place, and we're critical of things that we're seeing that are not headed in the right direction. And I think that the new CEO came in to me as a breath of fresh air on a lot of things. Even the manner in which he did a reorg really early on, it was bold. I think that there was a honeymoon period. I don't know how long that will last and whether we're getting to the end of the honeymoon period, if you will, of that. But I think it's an interesting time, and it's still too early to really say. And I know that we've talked about it on the show, which is why it showed up on our top 10. We should invite him on the show. Have we invited him on the show? Hey, let's do that. Let's invite him on the show and see what he thinks. It'd be really interesting to ask some questions of the CAO, not just at any time, but in 2022, in an election year. That should be pretty interesting.
You don't think he's been warned not to come on the show yet?
To be fair, we did invite him on the show.
We did
Did
once,
we?
yeah.
We
Yeah.
invited him onto the show through the city of Innisfil, and everything was kind of going well. And then it sort
Right.
of stopped midstream. So, we should do another annual
Invitation.
request. Yeah. We'll do the
He
invitation.
does strike me as somebody that might come on the show. I don't, whether he's been warned, Don, probably, but I mean, that'll, I guess this is where I was going. I'm not sure that folks really appreciate the distinction between the mayor, and we spend a lot of time talking about the mayor as if he is the city. And so maybe we're partly to blame for some of these things. The mayor is just one more elected representative that happens to be the mayor. To what extent he sets the agenda and what gets to the agenda, I think is a time for another conversation, not necessarily the theme of this show. But we do have a hard time distinguishing the mayor's office, and largely because of what's happening in terms of the investment of funds in the mayor's office and what they're doing with it to, prance around the mayor, and the difference between the city administration who actually runs this city. And I think that, a good CAO will understand that it's part of the job to have to work with the political aspects of the municipality, the council, its mayor, the setting of the agenda, the vision, the strategies theoretically that the city has, and the budget that's given to them to work with, and all those things. But I also think that I was really happy to see that this CAO came actually from someplace else, and we did not do the hashtag this small town thing to hire from within. And so that, I guess, is part of the reason why I'm concerned is how long he's going to last, because, we're pretty hard on anyone that comes in with like a fresh perspective on how things might run and how things might be different, because we like our made in Windsor solutions, which is why we end up with, vaccinations, on a line painted at our tunnel. So, yeah.
So I think it's interesting that we combine these two topics, and I know why you did, John, and it makes sense. We should be talking about Mayor Dilkins probably a little bit less, and we should be talking about CAO Raynar probably a little bit more. I'm reserving judgment on Jason Raynar. I think there are a lot of things based on his resume and his backstory and his performance in the early going as CAO. I think there's a lot that you can look at and say, hey, there's a lot of potential here. I do think that Jason Raynar, at least in my perception of it, based on what I see at council meetings, he came out kind of guns blazing, trying to effect a lot of change in a little bit of time. I think he's retrenching. I was critical of his performance at the budget, and maybe he decided that the budget survey was not the hill to die on. Maybe that was a tactical decision that he made, and then he kind of talked himself into some unfortunate comments, and that's a possibility. I guess it's possible, and the interpretation that I kind of put on it is that I don't think Jason Raynar forgot why he came here. I don't think he forgot what kind of a leader he wants to be and what kind of transformation that he wants to make in Windsor. I think he is grappling with the realities of Windsor politics and trying to figure out a way to do his job effectively and to lead the city and the city workers, the city bureaucracy, to do their job effectively in the political environment that we have. I don't envy him that job, because the last thing that you want to do as a CAO is make an enemy in the mayor's office. And I think you could see early on some of the councillors who are vote with the mayor a lot and particularly close to the mayor are not fans of Jason Raynar, who are very critical to the point of being a little bit insulting in terms of Jason Raynar's ideas and the way that he was presenting them. So you can see that there's a challenge there, and I don't underestimate the challenge. At some point, Jason Raynar is going to have to figure out how to effectively expand the scope of what he can do as the CAO of the city, figure out how to operate in this political environment effectively, or his time here won't be successful. And I really, truly wish him the best.
Agreed. I think,
sorry, go ahead, Pat.
Okay. The only thing I want to add that is just taking a look. I think we've started to see somewhat of a different approach to some of the report. Again, the mayor sets the agenda, right? So we can't forget that. So there's some really interesting dynamics that are there, but also taking a look at the reports and how they're going forward. I think if you watch that very closely, and that would be sort of at the weed level in some ways, I think there's been a shift in terms of how extensive, thorough, different aspects coming forward in those reports. And I think that is so key, that we often talk about things politically, or what makes the paper, or what 5 words were said at council that stood out, and yet it's in those reports that I think we find answers to what might be recommended and why, and to what extent there's push from the political arm versus the administration. And that's where I think it's way too soon to really judge. I think you're right, Doug, that there were some, things that needed to be done immediately, but I think that that's probably, good CAO 101, try to get things in really early on to sort of set your place, because it gets harder and harder. And I think it's going to be more challenging in a political year, because let's not forget what are politicians going to be looking for who are going to be running for re-election, and that is to look good. And how do you mesh that with the administration and the part of the responsibility of running the city that belongs actually to the CAO?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. Just kind of agree with what Pat said. Pat, I think it's important that the people who are running the city, we get more people from out of town. That may sound horrible and dismissive to people in Windsor, but I think we need some fresh ideas, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time, because the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented. He made some comments about paying our taxes in Bitcoin, which at the time would have been a fabulous investment, because we would have made about 30% on it if we sold at the right time. But now it's dropped back down, so it's a terrible idea. But at least he's looking outside the box. I mean, something like that in Windsor, the powers that be, and we talk about this all the time, it's the same 20 people who's been running the city for the last 3 decades. They just rotate from different boards and different organizations, and they all go to the same cool parties and drink 45-year-old whiskey when they're not supposed to be getting together at all. So I don't want to judge him too quickly. He got thrown into a new job in the middle of a pandemic, which is a whole other story. And do the Bitcoin thing. And so I think he's the only thing that I kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It was during the budget, and I wish I can remember. I believe it was when the transit issue came up. He was kind of dismissive about some of the points that were brought up by the people there, and that to me just instantly made me feel like, oh no, he's in with the cool kid at the cool table, and now he's just gonna go along for the ride and just say, well, why do I need to rock the boat? I'll just, I got a cushy gig here if I just do what they say. I think Windsor needs a lot more people on economic development, on running the city, that come in and go, oh my God, what have you hillbillies been doing for the last 30 years? This is not what it's like in the real world anymore. And I'm hoping he's one of those people. I have high hopes for him. So yeah, I'm not going to judge him yet. I hope he does come on the show and discuss some of his ideas, because I'd really like to hear them, because I don't like everything filtered through the mayor's office. I'd like to just talk to the guy one-on-one.
I'm not taking the Bitcoin bait.
Take the Bitcoin bait. Take the Bitcoin bait.
Lots to still see from him, as we've all said, as we've talked about before. It's a refreshing breath of fresh air right now, but we're gonna have to see how it all plays out. He's either gonna fall into a really, really comfortable lifestyle of parties that we're never gonna completely understand, because we're never gonna see the photographs from inside of them, or he's going to get muscled out because he's not going to do the things that are expected of him, and he won't do the pushback that's required of that could result in him getting muscled out. So, it's not the best situation. We'll see how much city changing is actually brought upon by him. Moving on, though, we grouped together the following topics as sort of our numbers 7, 7.5, and 8. Housing, density, city building, development, homelessness, and the downtown mission. I don't think that should be surprising to anyone. We can go to Don first about this one, quite frankly, and I think building in the idea of the need for more housing. Your perspective as a realtor here, how do all of these topics sort of interplay for you trying to sell the city?
Yeah, I mean, we've had many shows where we've talked about the mission, and as we all know, the former head of the mission, Ron Dunn, has left for greener pastures out east in, I believe, Halifax or somewhere. That whole thing is a disaster right now. That hopefully the new people running it can kind of get some kind of cognitive idea of what the mission's job actually is and how they can actually perform those duties. Getting into the housing topic, I mean, the housing issue, I mean, I deal with this every day. I think a lot of people think this is a local issue. This isn't a local issue. And it branches out into many different things, from economic development to zoning issues, to immigration issues, to our universities and that bringing in thousands of foreign students. None of these are bad things, but you have to prepare for these things to happen. And when you don't, this is the situation we get. I don't think various levels of government have really, they like the idea of what they're doing. They don't like the idea of having to sort out how to handle the problem. And it is a problem. It's a big problem. So, you know, the homeless issue in Windsor has been an ongoing thing. And I don't know what the solutions are. I'm not smart. You know, hopefully there's people smarter than me out there who are going to handle this. Throwing money at it is very important. And I don't think, like I brought up earlier, I think the only good thing about the pandemic, there's nothing good about it. So that's not the right phrases. It's really shone a light on these issues. And hopefully the people who are smarter than me figure something out and realize that this is a big issue and it's going to get worse because housing prices aren't going down unless we get a huge spike in interest rates and we stop bringing people from other countries into the immigration, which we're not going to do and we shouldn't do. But it's a numbers game, and that's what it is. You need more supply. You know, if you want to get into this topic, follow Dr. Mike Moffat on Twitter. I talk to him all the time on there. He's a very smart guy, but he also knows what the basics are. It's supply and demand, and that's what it is. And we're not grasping the simple things in that. And I think that's what's getting away from us. We're looking for complex solutions to really a simple problem.
Pat,
Yeah,
I shudder to bring your voice in because, you know, there's a lot that you have to say about some of these topics.
Well, I'll start with the fact that it was great to have Mike Moffat visit Windsor, and the team that brought him here and organized that event, and we were able to hear from him. And I agree with Jon that you know, there's a lot to learn there, and from somebody who's not from here. But of course, my target was the mission, and I had a really good segue because you just left the last one, Jon, talking about a breath of fresh air, and I was going to lead with, you know, the departure of the former head of the mission was a breath of fresh air and a very positive thing. You know, people, for those that think that I'm constantly critical, let me just say, I think one of the great things that is happening that we know is going to happen very quickly is the Welcome Center for Women and Families is finding a new home, long time coming. And there's an example of an organization who, through their reporting, through how they run, through Housing First initiatives, and the manner in which they provide the services to those who they serve in this community is exemplifies how it should be done. We know that the mission has been a problem in our community for a long time. I know that sometimes those that tune in and don't know us are going to think that I'm, of course, picking on who they serve. I am absolutely not. I think that in many ways, the reason we have not moved further ahead with assisting those who need the services of the mission, and I have a lot to say on this, which I won't necessarily right now, is because that the leadership was lacking there. So I am glad that that was one of our stories. I think the reason this has made the list is probably not the story that he left, but the fact that he came on our show and we had to go through, in my opinion, a lot of bullshit to listen to stuff that did not add up. And so people are free to go back and listen to that show and make up their own minds as far as that is concerned. He's left that organization in real need. And I hope to see, you know, where this is going to go with some new leadership. The board has a huge responsibility ahead of it. And I'm talking specifically of the board of the mission. And not only to take a look at whether they're going to focus on what their mission is, but also where they're going to, they've got some real estate, they've had some, you know, all sorts of, we don't have to rehash everything from the library to locations on Ouellette to the fact that they had to move out of different buildings, the possibility that they were going to go on McDougall to that not happening. It's still not clear. And I think that there's been less focus on them because I think there's respect for the organization to have to regroup and figure out where it's going. But this is in no way off anybody's radar in our community. And 2022, I think we're going to start to see what that looks like. And it's going to be very important for the city to see where it lands.
So I don't have a lot to add to what my able fellow panelists contributed on this. The only thing that I'll say is, in the big picture, when you look at a person like Ron Dunn, obviously a person with a lot of capabilities, a lot of talents, a lot of tools, particularly around communication. Ron Dunn was able to build relationships with people. He was able to get and hold the media's attention. He was able to get his message across. The problem, I think, with Mr. Dunn's tenure is that those tools were more often used to obscure than they were to illuminate these critical issues in our community. And I'll just use that to kind of segue to talking about the bigger issue itself. When you look at these big personalities, and we have a few of them in town, and I think that people who have the gift for communicating and getting attention and making the pithy statement when the microphone's in front of them, they can use that to talk about the policies, to clarify and illuminate the issues. And I think we have some folks that fit that category. Or they can use it to obscure and create these clouds of confusion around an issue in order to make it serve their own personal interests. And I'm hopeful that we'll see more of a focus on substantive issues and the details of policy that can move us forward. I don't disagree with your general statement, Don, that to some extent, poverty and homelessness and the opiate crisis, all of which are all wrapped up together, are bigger problems than Windsor, and they are in some ways intractable problems. But I think that we can do a lot by putting our heads down, listening to the experts, moving forward, and depoliticizing these critical issues, and just getting on with the work.
It's interesting, and I know that John, you're about to introduce our last two in the top 10 list, and I think that there's a theme there when we take a look at Ron Dunn and Doug's characterization of somebody who took the media spotlight and obfuscated, and not only in the media, but also how that organization was run. In other words, in my view, and I've said this before, there was a mission drift. They lost complete focus of who they were serving. It became numbers, like as if, the more you served, we should be patting you on the back. This means that we have more need in the community. I'm not suggesting that the mission or any one organization can solve these complex social problems, but I think there's an issue with agencies that focus too narrowly and don't see the connection that they have to the community, to the neighborhoods, and all those things. And I think there's also this empire building that was going on. That's a completely different problem. And then the whole mission drift. And then you add these large personalities and what they want to portray in the media, and you have a pretty big recipe for disaster, which we've seen in our community. And I hope that in many ways that those are the things that we can see clearly and demand of those that run these organizations, whether they're private organizations or whether they're run by boards or whether they're people in public office, that we demand that we see the fit and that we're all moving in some direction that makes sense, and hopefully based on data and on evidence and on what we know the experts in what the best practices are and what experts are bringing to the table. But when we take a look at the next two on the list, which are democracy, public consultation, and I see here that racism and hate speech are added here. You know, it's really interesting. I don't know that public consultation, when you put this list together, also included sort of the AD Knox consultation and some other consultations in our community. The, you know, the one line open-ended question from the stage 2 consultation on the mega hospital. And then we've got coming in, not to be excluded, sorry to jump on your work here, John, but number 10 being Invest Windsor Essex. And to me, there's a theme running among at least those last few ones, which is, you know, can we look at the core sort of mission, vision, values, strategic pillars of all of these sort of organizations, and what is happening on these initiatives, and do they align with what they're supposed to do, and to what extent do they move off? And I think that's where when they move off, we see the problems in this community, because we go for flashy, we go for our buddies and what our buddies want, and how does this fit into what our buddies want? And again, not to tie it back into the mission, I've said it before, but I think it's worth repeating at the close of 2021, and I will probably be repeating this at some point again, or at least some fashion of this. You know, when you have somebody running the homeless shelter in the downtown core, and they suddenly, because of whoever is on the board or whoever they've invited, and suddenly you are making public declarations that your organization and you as head of it, speaking on behalf of it, are supporting the move of a hospital from walking distance from where you're at. This makes zero sense. And to me, that is blatant in what is wrong with this community.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that. And I think one thing that jumps out at me when I look at this list is, why are we talking so much about Invest Windsor Essex? And I think Pat put her finger on the reason. It's because that organization has become politicized. They have started to engage in politics and push particular political agendas. Any non-governmental organization, any ABC, any arm's length organization has to be aware of politics and has to engage in politics in some way. If nothing else, they have to advocate on the issues that matter to them. Here's the test for Invest Windsor Essex. They felt it necessary to advocate on the hospital issue. What other item of advocacy has Invest Windsor Essex pushed in their entire history? But let's just focus on the last few years under Stephen McKenzie. What issue was important enough from an economic development standpoint that Invest Windsor Essex felt they needed to start to engage in advocacy? And the answer is nothing, except for the hospital, which to me, unfortunately, because I've worked with the folks down there, I know some of the folks at Invest Windsor Essex, there are great people working really hard to move the community forward. But when the organization becomes politicized at the top, it becomes far more difficult to be effective. And just to tie that into public consultation and that piece, I think that our consultations are also heavily politicized in Windsor. The ability for Windsor, whether it be the city or one of our major institutions, to go out, seek public input in the way that will be the most effective, that will elicit the most accurate information from the public, that is not a priority. What is a priority is checking the box and not being embarrassed by the outcome of public consultations. This goes back to the stuff that Jason Raynar had to say, talking shit about the budget public consultation because it did not produce a message that was amenable to his political master. That is the way that we approach consulting the public in this town from top to bottom. And it's why we really don't have any idea what the public wants. And if you want to talk about naysayers and cynicism and breeding cynicism in this town, when you don't take the feedback of people seriously and you make it obvious that you don't, and then you turn around and tell them what they think based on your phony baloney consultations, that breeds cynicism, that creates naysayers. If you want to clean that stuff up, do better on consultation, okay? Jim Morrison, I just had an exchange on social media with Jim Morrison on this very topic. I objected to his use of the term naysayers. If you really want to do something, Jim, about naysayers in our town, if you really want to make people feel more positively about this city, then take that as your issue, okay? That's a suggestion that I have for you. How about we actually collect meaningful feedback from people, present it honestly, and then talk about what we're going to do to address the things that people brought up, instead of engaging in sham consultations that aren't intended to go anywhere except to look good on a report that is going to drive the rubber stamp from City Council.
I'm so glad that you just went off on that little riff there. And you know, the problem is what you're proposing is a complete reorganization of not only the city, but our community. Like, we are politicized, from our budget process to our master plans to the engagement tools, as you said, as I was able to dunk on you guys when you suggested that it would actually be listened to by councillors. I mean, to astroturfed groups that are set up, to the NGOs that jump onto it. I mean, this community is stacked in so many different ways that the average citizen doesn't have an opportunity to be able to have the time to break through it layer by layer. We do our best job trying to present it, and God damn it, we do 50 to 54 episodes a year at an hour plus. It's as accessible as it possibly can be to someone who has a full hour plus a week to dive into some of the most mundane. I mean, it's a tried and true record for Windsor politics here, is that unfortunately this works. And it works because it depresses morale. It is propaganda, not in the sense that it's trying to get anyone to believe the fake hoods, although Lord knows we have them from Hold the Line on Taxes, even though that's not an accurate statement in and of itself. But it's also propaganda in the sense of it's so difficult for people to be able to just grab a hold onto what is real and what's not real. Because I have Fred Francis saying that, you know, Roseland's profitable, but then you have Don Merrifield saying, no, it's not. It's actually because of this, this, and this. And I can't figure it out unless I go get the actual papers to figure it out. And the budget makes it so difficult to figure out what it actually is. It's a stacked deck. So, you know, I guess my resolution is, yeah, we try to break it all down the way that we keep doing it. But I mean, it's such a big ask to depoliticize, because there's nothing that's not politicized.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, John. You know, and even for a show like this, because I mean, this whole show has been really about what listeners chose to listen to, and it's not necessarily what we think are the top news stories or anything like that. There's some we haven't even mentioned, and I know that we've got one Patreon under our belt there before the end of the year, which maybe will bridge some of those pieces together, maybe as a result. But, you know, it really is an investment of time to really pay attention, and not just to one issue, because you can have like a special interest that cares about one particular area of concern for the city or jurisdiction of the city or decision making. You know, it could be that I'm interested in, you know, safe injection sites, and so that's what I'm following, or speed bumps, or whatever the case may be. But really, to take a look at how the entire operation runs, and look at it from the big picture, from how we set aside numbers in the budget, to who are the players, to how we interact with other large organizations, to what has been consulted on, to how it's been consulted, to when there's table drops. Let's not forget that, right? Like the table drops in front of council, the dynamics around the council table, the dynamics of each elected councillor in their ward, possible future prospects, who might run, whether they could win, all those things that is a lot to have to do for anyone. And I think this goes back to, and it's not intended to be a criticism of the media. We're an opinion show, but what we need are facts, right? And we present what we know based on the media. We don't go out there and do investigative journalism. We do it based on experience, life experience, political experience, having been in the game. The fact that Jon, our youngest member on this panel, is the most cynical and right at the outset felt that, no consultation would get us anywhere. What does that say to us? So I guess maybe we can, one of the messages is not just the critique of the political landscape, but again, bringing it in to the media's responsibility to ask more of those questions. And I think that that's a really important point. Doug said it earlier. I'd like to reiterate that. Just get us the facts and we can work around the analysis, but we do need more facts. And in order to bring it full circle, I want to point this out. And when I was looking at it, now I know you did the numbers in terms of what was more popular in preparation for this show. I just went through our list week by week of podcasts, and I noticed that I think it was our first podcast of 2021. So talk about bringing it 12 months forward and year in review. Our first podcast was called "We Can't Wait Holiday Cards." So if for those that may remember, that show was about, in fact, the holiday cards that were sent out, part of an investment on the hashtag "We Can't Wait," again for the mega hospital. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not mistaken, the funding came through Invest Windsor Essex. So here we are a year later. Don, did you get your holiday card this year?
I got one of them 45-year-old bottles of whiskey that they were drinking at the restaurant there. So it was quite tasty.
I see.
So I'm a big fan of everything that's going on in Windsor right now. Full support.
There you go. There you go.
And I'm making a stupid joke, and that's going to be my final point on this whole thing. As I mentioned earlier, this city has been run by the same 20, 30 people for the last 2 decades, 3 decades. And unfortunately, all the people in these organizations, whether it's, I'm not even going to name them because then people get mad at me, but they know who they are. I want to see one of these organizations call out the city for saying, this is stupid. We shouldn't be doing it this way. We should be doing it. They are all buddies. They're all friends. They all hang out at the same cool parties. And we don't like, we joke about made in Windsor solutions. They don't like people from the outside coming in and telling them they're wrong because, and this goes for politics. This goes for industry leaders in this town. This goes for developers in this town who I know very well. And this goes for union leaders. There's a lot of people who have very comfortable, well-set lives, keeping Windsor exactly the way it is without rocking the boat. And if we've learned anything, especially in the last 2 years, the boat in Windsor needs to dramatically be rocked. And no one here seems willing to do it. And when people like us, and I'm not going to sit here and talk about how great we are, but even if we call out criticism and say something, the first thing everybody does is attack us as you're naysayers, you're negative, you're not on board, blah, blah. There's a million, they throw lawsuits at it, all kinds of stuff. We need more of that. And it doesn't need to always be us. There should be 5 other shows like ours or leaders in the community also saying the same thing, whereas we want better. We need to do better. Talk to people. Like Doug had mentioned earlier, look, don't talk to me about how to create the tech industry in Windsor. I don't know, but talk to people who do know. And who doesn't know is someone who was appointed because he's the mayor's buddy down at, economic development, or someone at, WeTech, or someone who hangs out at the cool Beach Grove parties. Talk to people who actually know outside this community who can make a difference. We did a show a long time ago. Doug and I were up in Toronto. We talked to the lady who was head of the economic development in Hamilton, very smart woman. And she said they had to go through the same thing. They had to break through that. Look, you can't just keep doing the same thing and expecting different results and paying lip service to it. And it's hard. And some people get offended, and some people in this city who may lose their jobs, but that's what needs to happen. And nothing's going to change if we keep doing the same thing. It's a running joke. I make the same stupid joke every year. Windsor's slogan should be, don't blame us. We didn't even really try. And it's dumb, but I actually mean that, because I don't think we really try on a lot of things. We don't want to, because they're comfortable. Life's easy for them. Why would they want to change things?
Trying is hard.
100%.
Trying's really hard, because then you could fail. But you guys used to go places to do the show too.
John,
you didn't just used to get together, but you used to go to other places.
Look,
Man.
John, with you, we'd have to get, your parents' consent. There's going to be, we couldn't go drinking at bars at night and spend the Irish Rose City Politics slush fund. You're kind of a drag on the whole situation.
Word of advice, John. If you do end up traveling with Don on the Rose City Politics dime, top bunk. All I'm going to say,
all the time.
Top bunk.
Yeah. Everything flows down.
Well, I will bring my youngness back into this for a second, Pat, and to answer your question, what does it say about the cynicism that I was able to see through what I call the stunt of the engagement tool? It says that you guys only came to learn how to be in this environment. I was born in this environment. This is all that I know. It's all that I see. And I find it interesting, but you know what? I really do think that we all have an opportunity here. We're going to get overseas. We're going to open up a nice little consulting firm, Politique de la Ville Rose, and we're going to start to get some of this consultation cash. We're going to get a couple names that aren't related to us. We can be investors from like a numbered corp. No one's going to know it's us unless they listen to this one episode here, where my cynicism has gone full bore. Time to cash out. For those listening, though, the top 10 that you guys helped dictate for this show: pandemic at number 1, amenities and asset development, transit, budget, Windsor Works, auto diversification, city leadership, the mayor and CAO, housing density, city building development, homelessness and the mission, democracy and public consultation, and tied with that was the city's anti-racism initiative and hate speech and the lack of meaningful consult there. And then finally at number 10 was invest Windsor Essex. I think we did a good show with this one. We're all sort of nodding in agreement here. We gave you a full 2 hours of it. So that is always one of the gifts that we like to do at the end of the year. We also, one last thing as well. One of the top listened to show was the Ed Sleeman show. I don't know if that was mentioned during the past 2 hours. It's been a bit of the whirlwind. So wanted to let you all know that, coming in just before a really good interview we had with Councillor Bordelin. So one counselor had a bit of a flub and came in at number 1, and one counselor came in at number 2 with a lot of really good perspectives. Reno, don't work so hard, because you could easily be number 1 without putting in that type of work. This is Rose City Politics, though, and just a bit of breaking news. We got one source coming to me right now saying actually that the city of Windsor has now moved into work from home mode. So maybe we'll be finding out in the next couple days what that looks like and how those decisions will be impacting you with this new variant that we're all still dealing with. But we've got, I think, one last show. We're going to try to get to you. If you're a Patreon fan, might be able to get to it tomorrow. If not, it's, we've always got the intention. It's always there is the best way to put it. But know that you're always helping us put together these shows on a weekly basis as well. This is December 29th. It was our year in review. Our regular panel tonight included Doug Sartori, Don Merrifield Jr., Pat Papadeus, and myself, John Lidke. We've been able to put this together because of you Patreon subscribers. If not, head to patreon.com/Rose City Politics. We have a new article coming out in BizX Magazine in January. We are at bizxmagazine.com on all of your favorite social media and podcasting apps. And Rose City Politics has been able to broadcast live on tape this entire year, 2021, thanks to the kind support of LiUNA 625. Building better communities. We will be seeing you next week for the first episode of 2022.